Welcome to our first webinar of the semester. This semester, we are focusing on the upcoming election and issues related to it. As always, we are going to discuss issues that we hope are relevant to our students and what they're learning in their classes. Today, the webinar is presented by me, Allegra Davis Hanna, and I will mostly be interviewing our primary presenter.
Hi, I'm Misty Wilson-Mehrtens. I am the Social Sciences Chair and I teach history at TCC Connect.
So, Misty, will you tell us a little bit about, so today we're going to talk about specifically women voters and the history of women having the vote and how women influence elections. So can you start with some history of the women's vote, which I'm sure you know a lot about?
So this year we are marking the 100th anniversary of women having the right to vote. And I think that sometimes when we teach this in high schools especially, we present it as a very linear story. Like some women wanted the vote, they had a convention, they held some parades, they got the right to vote.
Mm-hmm.
Just not what history really looks like.
Yeah. I mean, that's definitely what I think of.
So right around the time that we're becoming our own country, women in certain states actually had the right to vote. So New York, Massachusetts, New Hampshire, New Jersey, they had all given women the right to vote. And then once we create the Constitution, all of those states except New Jersey took the right away. And then New Jersey takes it away in 1790. So women have the right to vote, then they don't have the right to vote. Now they have to work to get it. As we're forming this country, there are some women saying, "Remember the ladies," and that's a pretty famous quote from Abigail Adams to her husband John, saying all husbands would be tyrants if they could, comparing husbands to King George. So remember that the ladies have some rights too. He wrote back and basically was like, "That's a funny joke." So that didn't happen. In the 1820s and 30s, Americans really start focusing on gender roles and what it means to be women and what it means to be men. We're going to see a lot of emphasis placed on women in the home and nurturing and caring for children and creating good citizens by being good mothers. But that really boxes women out of politics. So in the 1840s, some women decided that is not enough. And so we're going to see the Seneca Falls Convention, 1848. This is the first convention we ever have where there is a direct call to have the right to vote. And I'm sure you've heard of the Seneca Falls Convention at least once or twice.
I have, yes.
So at the end of it, they signed the Declaration of Sentiments and Resolutions that outlines their main issues, their goals, and that they want women to have the right to vote. Unfortunately,
Okay.
the movement doesn't stay united for very long. Seneca Falls was a really interesting time in the movement because it was very intersectional. During the 1830s and 40s, women had joined abolition societies. And so there were calls for former slaves to get the right to vote, and there were calls for women to get the right to vote. They're working together. But that doesn't last long. After the end of the Civil War, former male slaves got the right to vote. And women felt that they had helped earn those rights, but then they were still kept out. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So in 1868, Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony formed the American Equal Rights Association, which is an intersectional, racially inclusive organization designed to get universal suffrage. They are opposing people who think that, well, just men should have the right to vote, and now once we've gotten freed slaves the right to vote, we're all good. Mm-hmm. So the more radical arm of this at that point.
So were they, I was going to say, were they in the minority? Were most suffragettes not wanting to be inclusive?
So being a suffragette overall puts you in the minority.
Sure.
Less than women wanted the right to vote. And then
less than half of women wanted the right to vote?
Yes. And then being a suffragette that thinks we should have racial equality, that's a minority of the minority.
Wow.
Right. It's a whole different world. All right, So women are going to have to start actually fighting, literally fighting for the right to vote. Stanton and Anthony are going to go on to form a pretty radical group called the National Woman Suffrage Association. And the conservative counterpoint to that is the American Woman Suffrage Association. Basically, the argument here is going to be a passive, let's wait for our turn to get the right to vote, versus let's go to the streets and let's march and let's be loud about this.
Mm-hmm.
Susan B. Anthony doesn't live to see the 19th Amendment come into being. She dies before it happens. In 1913, Alice Paul is going to take over the Congressional Union, which is a pretty radical group that's going to try to mimic some of what the British suffragettes are doing. So the British suffragettes had a motto, deeds, not words. Sort of anything that we need to do to get the right to vote, we're willing to do it. Paul is going to organize the women's suffrage procession, which is what you're seeing a, poster advertisement for here.
It looks like a crazy parade.
It looks very fancy, doesn't it?
Yes.
So this is going to be on the eve of Woodrow Wilson's inauguration, and this was the largest suffrage parade we'd ever had up to that point. It's in Washington, D.C. It's well planned. It's mostly women who are participating, and the parade is attacked by a mob.
What?
Yeah, women are injured. Some of them were physically assaulted. Policemen are there. They're watching this happen. But the policemen either were indifferent to what was happening or they were sympathetic to the mob.
Oh my gosh.
So we have about 100 marchers that are hospitalized, and we have 0 arrests.
Sounds
Eventually,
fun.
there's an investigation into this, and the DC superintendent of the police his job because he wasn't forcing the police to do their jobs. When we talk about women fighting for the right to vote, I think that we forget sometimes that there were women who were arrested for this. So if we can look at the next picture.
What is this?
So these women that are arrested generally are given the choice of somewhere between 30 to 60 days in jail, or they have to pay a $25 fine. And most of the women, to show that they are believers in this cause, are going to choose jail. And several of the women, once in jail, go on hunger strikes. It would be really, really bad PR if we have women dying in jails. We can't let that happen. So some of these jails are going to devise forced feeding programs so that women who are on a hunger strike won't die of hunger. So they have this tube that is forced down their throats, and what they're pouring down is a mixture of like raw eggs and usually some sort of milk. It's very high in protein, so these women won't starve. But this is, of course, a violent act. I mean, it's assaulting people. And a lot of times, this is going to make women physically ill. Their stomachs can't handle what's being shoved into them.
That's really bad.
Some of these women are also going to be put in what we today call solitary confinement. This is going to heat up. In September of 1917, the House of Representatives creates a committee to discuss women's suffrage. So Massachusetts Representative Joseph Walsh is opposed to the committee, and I just have some wonderful quotes here. He says that the House is giving into the nagging and iron-jawed angels, and he refers to these suffragettes as bewildered, deluded creatures with short skirts and short hair. What do we think about that?
I'm not a fan, to be honest with you.
Yeah, me neither. So when we're talking about suffragettes, I think that we forget this in the modern era, but putting "et" on the end of it was meant to be derogatory.
Oh, yeah.
And we can probably talk about that a little bit.
I mean, it is a diminutive, right? So it's supposed to insinuate that the original part of the word, we're talking about something that's smaller or I guess, less important as a suffix.
Kind of, yeah, like kind of cute, right?
Yeah, and you see it a lot with like dance teams or sometimes female athletes get added to the end. Um, People sometimes think of it as just a way to distinguish between genders, but it is a way to kind of make it smaller, cuter, less serious for sure.
So the reporter who originally started calling these women suffragettes was mocking them because he was saying, they're not really suffrage fighters. All they're concerned about is these women.
Right, so kind of insinuating if what your concern is about is women, then it's cute.
Yeah, it's adorable, right?
Yeah.
Those little adorable ladies wanting to vote. So suffragettes adopt the word, they reclaim it, and I think they did so successfully to the point that we kind of forget that it was meant to be a mocking term.
Mm-hmm. I did never know, so.
So in the late 1910s, we really start to debate the 19th Amendment. What would women's suffrage look like? How would it work? And so there's an article from The Atlantic that I want to just read a real quick quote from because it's talking about the opposition to suffrage. A woman does not wish to turn aside from her higher work, which is itself the end of life, to devote herself to government, which exists only that this higher work may be done. Can she do both? No. So the argument being made is that like women are so good and so pure and so virtuous that they need to focus on family and they don't need to focus on politics. The counter argument to that would be if women are so good and so virtuous, couldn't they make politics better? But that was pretty easily dismissed. I want to show you, if you go to the next slide, some images here of propaganda against the 19th Amendment. Because again, I think we forget that this was a minority movement, meaning that less than half the people in the country supported this. So in this one, you have the suffragettes, and you have George Washington, and he's kind of lamenting what's happening to the country if women get the right to vote.
And so people would pass these out as a way of fighting against women's suffrage.
Yes, or publish them in newspapers or put them on posters. This is propaganda for sure against women's suffrage. The next slide.
Oh.
This is my favorite one ever. One of the arguments against suffrage was that it's only old, ugly women who want the right to vote. And so what you're seeing here is a bunch of old, ugly, single women, and they're going to legislate that men have to marry them.
Oh, so they're caricatures, they're drawn to be intentionally ugly.
Yes.
And the argument here is they just want to vote so that they can make men marry them.
Yes. Because if you were young, pretty, you wouldn't need to legislate that. You would just already have a husband.
Yeah, and what else would a woman really want?
Exactly. On the next slide, we have a couple of more examples of this anti-suffrage propaganda, probably just because I think they're hilarious. So this first one says, the development of a suffragette. At 15, a little pet. At 20, a little coquette. At 40, not married yet. And at 50, a suffragette. So we have this pretty young girl. If she's not married by a certain time, she's going to turn to suffrage.
She sure did change her appearance between 20 and 40.
Yes, she did. So again, middle one, every man must marry. The evil suffragette's going to force people into marriage. And then I love this one here. I'd like to vote, but my wife won't let me.
Oh, so the insinuation here is if women get the right to vote, then men
are going to have to do the laundry.
Oh, okay.
There is an argument made, a real argument made, that if we let women vote, we are going to flip all of the gender roles in our country. So suddenly men are going to have to do laundry and cook and watch children. And really, that's a fate worse than death.
He doesn't look very happy.
No, his wife won't let him go vote. That's so sad. Yeah.
If laundry and not being able to vote is a fate worse than death, then why would they want to bestow it to women? I mean, did they think of it? No? Okay.
No, you're applying logic and reason. You shouldn't do that. All right, so the 19th Amendment is going to be ratified in 1920. So just in case anybody doesn't remember from the government classes, when we changed the Constitution, the amendments actually go back to the states and we have to vote, and 3/4 of the states have to agree. So Tennessee is the state that's going to push us over the line and get us into women having suffrage. In 1920, the first year that women are able to vote, only 36% of them turned out to vote across 10 states. And those are the states that actually checked boxes for male or female. So those are the ones we have data for. But we can assume that it's pretty likely that that's going to be what it is nationwide.
And just to be clear, the 19th Amendment gave white women the right to vote. Is that correct?
No. So the 19th Amendment gave women, regardless of their sex or gender, the right to vote.
Okay.
Supposedly, combined together, the 14th and 15th Amendments already gave freed slaves, African Americans, the right to vote, and any citizens born here the right to vote.
Mm-hmm.
But in actuality, states have passed barrier laws. So things like the poll tax, the good character test. So while you might legally have had the ability to vote if you were African American, the state has prevented you from doing so.
Okay.
Legally, at this point, every person born here who is a citizen should now be able to vote. But that's not the way it functions in real life. So we have to have the civil rights movement a little bit later.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yes.
Okay.
So the federal law technically gives it the right, but state and local barriers still prevent lots of people, primarily people of color, from being able to access the right to vote.
Yeah. And some things like the poll tax are a 2-for-1, because not only do they get rid of people of color from voting, but it also doesn't allow whites to vote.
Right. So only the wealthy or those who had disposable income and were willing to spend it on voting would be able to.
Exactly.
They really charged people money to vote?
Yes. You had to pay a tax to vote.
Just seems.
I told you, it's a whole different world.
It is and it isn't.
So in those first years that women have the right to vote, from what we can tell in the data, we have a 32-point gap between men voting and women voting. But just adding the 30% of women that are voting is enough to make the parties start shifting some of what they're doing. So I really like this picture because we have a 1920s flapper. She's just got the right to vote. And we have the Democratic Party and the Republican Party both trying to sway her to their side. So which one is she going to pick? The logic up to this point was that women would vote as a block. They would all vote together. All women have the same concerns, which we now know, of course, is not true. But because both parties are trying to sway women to joining them, for the first time ever in the 1920s, we actually have some national legislation aimed at women. So one of the first things that's passed is the Shepherd-Towner Act, which distributed funds for healthcare to pregnant women. Before that happened, we had the highest maternal mortality rate of any Western nation. And then in 1920, it amazingly starts to drop as soon as women get the right to vote. So it's not that the right to vote magically protects you in childbirth.
But once you have more access to government, you can start to insist on legislation that protects women.
Exactly. So 80% of American women before this act did not have adequate prenatal care. So that shows you just how many people are affected immediately as soon as women get the right to vote, even if they themselves are not going to the polls. Another act that's going to be passed really quickly in 1922 is the Cable Act, which allowed American women to maintain their citizenship even if they married an immigrant. Kind of amazing that we needed a law for that. And then in 1922, we have our first female senator, Rebecca Felton. Now this one's a little tricky because her husband died, and so she's appointed in her husband's stead, and her term only lasted 2 days. But still, we had a female senator. You broke the barrier. No other woman can come behind you. Women are going to be slow to start exercising this power to vote, which I think is kind of shocking to us today. So in 1964, for the first time, women registered to vote at a number higher than men, but they didn't actually turn out to vote that way. In 1980, 59.4% of voting age women cast ballots, which was for the first time equal to men. And in every election since 1980, women have voted in higher numbers than men. So if we just look at the last decade, about 20 million more women than men have voted in general elections. And I put this picture in here because I think this is really interesting. It's tradition now, after women go vote, they take the sticker and they go to Susan B. Anthony's grave and they put the stickers on her grave because she herself never got that right. But it's a way to honor the work that she did for this before she died.
Wow. I like that.
Mm-hmm. I think another thing that's interesting in our data recently in elections is that women of color are some of the most consistent voters that we have.
Mm-hmm.
African American women vote between 65 to 70% in pretty much every major election.
Which is a higher percentage than any other voting bloc. Is that right?
Yes, Asian and Hispanic women are right at about 50%, and white women are right about 60%.
Interesting.
So, yeah. So this question's developed in political science circles and in historical circles of, is there truly a women's vote? Do women vote as a monolithic voting bloc? And what we mean by that is if you have an issue that you vote around and you only vote on that and you always vote the same way as everyone else in your group. And for a long time, the assumption was that women, because they are all women, are going to share all the exact same concerns. And what we found out is that women are actually people and they're nuanced. And there's a lot of things that can factor their political leanings, including not limited to their gender. So maybe your race plays a role, your age plays a role, your class plays a role in how you're going to vote, your family of origin plays a role. Mm-hmm. It's not just if you're male or female, which I'm surprised it took us 50 years to realize that, but it did. A lot of scholars now think of this not as a gender gap, but a gender generation gap, because it becomes useful to break down women of differing generations to look how they vote versus just looking at women as one group. And that gender gap exists for men too, right? So men who are 80 are going to vote on different issues than men who are 20.
Yes.
So it's a more inclusive way to look at how women vote. In the faculty committee that put together our webinar series, we're all 3 women. And so the original early logic would state that we should all have exactly the same political views. And I asked all of us to take a political typology test. And what we ended up with is that we have a solid liberal, a disaffected Democrat, and a new era enterpriser.
So one of those is very left, one of those is kind of left, and one of those is right of center if we were looking at a political spectrum?
Yes. And the disaffected Democrat and the new era entrepreneur are also less likely to vote along party lines. So more likely to be more like what we call independents.
Okay.
They could back and forth.
So they might vote for a candidate who isn't one party or the other. They might vote based on particular issues.
Yes, and they might even vote for a third-party candidate. So even though we have 3 college-educated women, it turns out that we don't have the same political perspectives. And that was just a micro example of us not having a voting bloc as women. Mm-hmm. So now I'm going to turn this over to you.
Because I don't know much about history, but man, do I watch the news. So there is obviously an election coming up, and so this is something that
Really?
I know, hard to believe,
but like it's been going on for like 4 years already.
It has for the most part. So this is something that people research and poll and survey and talk about and investigate, because before we have any actual election results, I guess people need something to talk about. So we're going to do some polls and discuss the results. One poll that was really interesting to me is a poll from Axios, and it is about how engaged we expect women to be in the 2020 election. And so they polled 800 likely voters. So these are people who self-identify as someone like, I'm probably going to vote in the election. And most of them were, well, more than, I mean, you can see the numbers, right? 39% of them were Democratic women and 23% of them were Republican women. And what was interesting is close to half of them were millennial women. So that's women born between 1980 and 2000.
Yes.
Roughly. And about 40% of them were women of color. So they expect a lot of engagement from women in the political process. Even more.
And it's interesting that we're at 100 years, right? And women are now seen as likely to engage.
Yes. And so this is a hypothetical graph from 538, and they do just a bunch of numerical research for the most part. And this is just what it would look like if only women voted. So
that's interesting.
We would have 275 Democratic districts and 160 Republican districts. And this is based on information from the 2018 midterm election. So if only women voted, then we would have far more blue districts than red. It looks like more red, but that's because the red is bigger, but electoral maps are misleading when you look at them because states like Wyoming take up a lot of space but don't have a lot of seats or districts. But
right.
This is just an interesting, number one, it's interesting that somebody put this together, right? Somebody researched the question, what would happen if only women voted? And it's also interesting what the results were. Something else from 538 is the gender gap. And so this shows us from back to 1992, there was like a 6% gender gap, and in the 2018 midterm election, there was a 23. Now, this isn't women and men voting. This is women and men voting differently.
Right. So this isn't just the numbers of people that vote, but this is men were more likely in 2018 to vote Republican by 4 points, and women are likely to vote Democratic by 19 points. And so that's a 23-point difference.
Yeah.
Okay.
So as you can see, and this is just a bunch of headlines that I picked up very quickly because this is something that gets researched and talked about a lot. People are very, very interested in how women are going to vote and whether women are going to vote as a block and what women are most interested in. And of course, generationally, like which groups of women are going to decide elections. So, I mean, we can go all the way to specific suburban Pennsylvania women is something that this article is about. Or we can talk about women who are 50 and older. And this is an article from the AARP, so take that with a little grain of salt. But people are very invested in thinking about how women might vote, will vote, what compels us to vote, what we're looking for when we go to vote, and why it's possible that some women are not as interested in electing a female president as they are in other particular issues or outcomes of the election. And it's not unusual for people who are discussing politics to talk about voting blocks. And so we talk about suburban people, we talk about income level, we talk about whether you have a college degree, whether you have a high school diploma, whether you're a woman or a man. So people talk about those voting blocks a lot, but if you notice, a lot of those things are more specific than woman or man. And it's starting to be noticed that suburban Pennsylvania women might have something in common, but all women don't necessarily have something in common when they go to vote. I think
So when we see articles that say women will decide the 2020 election, should we believe that headline or should we investigate further?
well, always investigate further. I mean, I think that turnout will determine the election. I think that these more specific demographic markers are going to be more important. So how many young people vote, how many people over 50 vote, how many educated people vote, how many people who are invested in particular issues vote. I think those things are more important than just women or men. Although it's not significant, because if you go back and look at this, there is a general gender divide. That doesn't mean
So looking at this chart, what it's saying is women are more likely to vote Democratic. Just overall, women are more likely to vote Democratic. So if
they were in 2018, yes.
So if your woman in 2018 voted, Republicans would have an advantage. If fewer men voted, Democrats would have an advantage.
Yes. But that is also why people look at this information and they make concerted efforts to court particular groups of voters. So you will hear people running for president discuss issues that they know appeal to specific groups of people. And that is a way to make sure that they can get more women or people from Pennsylvania to vote for them. I mean, when we talk about industrial jobs, they're talking specifically to people who live in states like Ohio and Pennsylvania. And when we talk about things like paid family leave, you're talking about everyone, but that's something that is mostly appealing to female voters.
So when we're looking at these polls and we're looking at these articles, we really need to be kind of reading between the lines and seeing what they're targeting and how they're asking the questions too.
Yes, and as always, you have to read between the lines of what presidential candidates are saying, because they are attempting to appeal to groups that they see have power. And these articles and all of this research shows you that even if women aren't a monolithic voting bloc, even if we don't all vote the same way, we vote in large numbers. And so it's important to speak to issues that women care about, regardless of whether you're a solid liberal or a solid Republican.
So in your estimation, do you feel like the power of the women vote is more in the numbers rather than in how they vote?
I think the power is that we can propel issues to the forefront. So things that women have been discussing and advocating for can get broader publicity and broader support, because it's very well known that women turn out to vote in large numbers. And I think that election math is very specific, and that's why they drill down to these points about suburban Pennsylvania women, because It can turn out that one county in one state can decide an election. And so they do have to investigate very specific things. But when they make these broad appeals, when they do these big speeches, they're trying to include as many people as they can from as many of those voting blocks.
Something I would like our students to be paying attention to as we get into the general election, because August is the 100th anniversary. I believe you're probably going to see a lot of articles and a lot of discussion around women voting for 100 years and what does women's voting look like.
Mm-hmm.
I just want them to be aware of that conversation and paying attention to it as we go into the general election. Because in the media, we like nice round anniversary numbers, right?
Yes.
And that fills airtime.
Yes. And women have been able to vote for 100 years, but that doesn't mean that all women have been walking down the same path for 100 years.
And it also doesn't mean that women were voted in really high numbers until about 40 years ago.
Yeah.
Sad that 1980 is 40 years ago now, but yeah, 40 years.
Please don't bring that up.
So what do we have coming up in future webinars?
So again, our webinars are always going to be about information literacy, about finding the truth, investigating beyond the surface. But this semester we are focused on the upcoming election and issues related to it. So,
and I should say that we picked this based on student feedback from last semester.
Yes, this is the number one most requested topic from students, is to talk about politics, elections, and those related issues. Absolutely.
And trying to break it down so where they can understand what's happening.
Yes. And that's great, because that means that our students are invested in what's happening and they are interested in knowing more and being able to understand and access more information about, not just politics, but elections and legislation and things that affect their lives. So sometimes we get caught up in the politics and the elections and the headlines, but we have to remember these are people who make legislation, right? They sign documents that change how much we pay in taxes and how we live our lives and what rights we have.
Exactly.
So later this month, we have a webinar on primaries and party radicalization, and that's great because we will be voting in a primary in Texas in the very near future. And so we'll talk about how primaries affect party platforms.
On March 4th, we're going to talk about 2020 being a census year and what that means for us, what that means for Texas. That being counted is important, not just because we get more representatives based on that, but because a lot of information is gained from that by historians, by political scientists, and we want to make sure we have an accurate representation of our state.
We also get more money.
Of course.
That's
also important too.
For some people, a larger government appropriation of money is more important than whether historians have lots of rich information.
Well, I don't know those people.
But I will be interested to know about how the census specifically has impacted Texas in the past and will do so in 2020. On March 25th, we're going to talk about first-time voters, which some of you may be. And that doesn't mean people who just turned 18. It could be people who are 45 and have never felt compelled to vote before. So we'll talk about what is driving first-time voters to the polls and what issues they're really concerned about or interested in.
And I believe we'll also have a brief discussion in that one about generational topics.
Yes.
How across generations, the issues that we are concerned about shift and change.
Yes, because if you've already paid off your student loans, you probably don't care about student loan debt. Just as an example.
So in April, go ahead. In April, we're going to talk about candidate coverage. So this is how the media looks at the candidates, how the media maybe intentionally or unintentionally shapes the narrative around certain candidates. I think this is an issue where gender, again, is probably going to come up.
It is, and it's important to remember that the media mostly covers things that will attract eyeballs to the screen. And
clicks.
Yeah, or clicks. And on our very last webinar of this semester on April 29th, we're going to talk about how our country is, how we have more things in common than we may realize, and things that people of all parties or all locations care about. And so it seems like we're really divided, but perhaps we are not.
I think that's a series that we have coming up.
Yes.
All right, so I know the question that everybody has is, how do I get credit for watching this?
So once you've watched the whole video, which you basically have at this point, you will see a link under the YouTube video to take a survey. You will answer all of the questions. It's very important that you include your name and your teacher's name so that we can send this information to your instructors to make sure that if they are awarding extra credit or class credit, that you get credit for attending. We can't make your teachers give you credit for attending, but we will let them know that you successfully completed the survey and demonstrated that you watched the video. If you have questions or suggestions for future webinars, there's a space in the survey for that as well. So if there's something you want to make sure that we cover, a topic or a candidate or a certain issue, just put that in the survey as well, and we will consider that as we plan the future webinars.
That quiz link is active for 48 hours. So we are going to be posting this Wednesday afternoon. That quiz link will be active until sometime on Friday evening, usually, when I remember to put it down. And beyond that, if you're watching this video after that point, you need to talk to your instructor about how you're going to get credit for watching this, if you're going to get credit for watching this.
Yes. So join us.
Go ahead. I'd also like to apologize that this one wasn't live. Due to the weather, we've had some technical issues. So we had to pre-record this and then post it later. That's generally how we do this.
That is not. But if you have questions that came up while you were watching, put them in the survey, and we'll answer them in our next webinar. So we want to make sure that we address the questions that you have. So we will add a question to the survey to give you a place to ask us any questions you have about the women's vote or the history of women's suffrage. And we'll take a minute in the next webinar to answer any questions that you guys had to make sure that we can cover it. I do want to thank you for joining us for the webinar. We look forward to talking with you in the future. And again, your feedback is very important to us, so let us know how we're doing and what you'd like us to discuss.
Thank you.
Thanks.